Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion, New Storytelling Formats for Decolonized Journalism when Innovation and Inclusion comes together. All my favourite stuff. So it's great to see so many of you choosing to be here in this perfect gelato weather. But I guess it's becoming increasingly clear that if you're prioritising ice cream over this panel, then you're probably a little bit of a racist. It's like, that's how you figure it out, right? So if you go outside, you see someone with a gelato, racist. It's always good to have a clue, right? So my name is Shirish Kulkarni. I'm a journalist, researcher and community organiser, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this conversation in partnership with the New Humanitarian. Firstly, because this topic is one that's very close to my own heart, and secondly, because I get to spend time with you all, and thirdly, because I get to learn from these incredible innovators we have here today, Rachel Hamada, Xing Xiang, and Annie Slemrod. So I'm going to ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll get straight into it. So if I can start with you, Rachel.
Yep, is the mic working? Okay, yeah, cool. So my name is Rachel Hamada, and I have two main roles. I am the founder and the chair of The Ferret, which is a Scottish investigative journalism outlet. And I'm also the lead on the community-led investigations project at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism.
Lovely. And Xing?
Hi everyone, my name is Xing Xing. I'm the editor-in-chief of Vice UK and US, and I was the editorial lead on the Unfiltered History project.
Lovely. And Annie, who I can't see because you're so far away.
Hi, I'm Annie Slemrod. I'm Middle East editor at the New Humanitarian, which is a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on humanitarian crises.
Thank you all. So firstly, to give you all a roadmap for what we're going to be discussing, we're going to start by putting this conversation into context by looking at why we need to decolonize journalism, what that means, and why new storytelling formats are an important part of that. We're then going to be looking at some of the approaches Rachel, Xing, and Annie have taken to those problems, and talking pretty honestly about the strengths and weaknesses, the wins and the challenges. And we'll also be focusing, I hope, on some actionable insights, things you can all take away as information, inspiration, food for thought, and maybe things to try in your own newsrooms. And I'll also make sure, of course, to leave some time for questions from you all to help with that. Sound like a plan? Yeah, all good. So part of that, though, is making very clear that we up here are not making any claims to be perfect, to having all the answers, or having some kind of secret decolonization source that makes us the experts. We may very well not even be the right people to be doing this. But I think, like lots of people, we're seeing the problem, are trying our best to understand it, and are experimenting with different approaches that might help us address that problem. And so I think this is like a collective act of learning and sharing together. So I just thought it was important to name that for you all. So let's say, firstly, I think it's important to put this conversation into context to help us understand why we need innovation in storytelling and what our starting points might be. So I'm going to start with the same question to each of you, which is, what do you see as the key failures of journalistic storytelling, which mean that it needs to be decolonized? So I'll start with you, Rachel.
I feel like I could talk on this for an hour, so I'm going to try and keep it brief. And obviously there'll be plenty of points that the others will want to address as well. But I think that taking a really structural approach to this is important, and I think there are so many structural issues across the journalism industry that affect what storytelling we end up doing, which stories we tell, and kind of where and how we publish those stories and who then accesses them. And I don't think that we're necessarily having the right conversations about this still, partly because of the demographics of most newsrooms across Europe, unfortunately. And I think it means that we still keep quoting the same people's in stories, we keep telling stories the same ways. There's a lot of good innovation happening, but probably not enough. So I just think it's a really important conversation to be having.
So which is why I say that we might not even be the right people to be doing this. Xing?
Yeah, I think, it's a reaction against the dominant voice in newsrooms, which is, white, middle to upper class, highly educated, cis, straight men who've, in the UK at least, been the dominant voice in journalism for decades. And it's about kind of platforming the voices of people who have been historically underrepresented in the media, and therefore reaching out to those audiences who also feel like the media doesn't speak to them. And it's about kind of embracing the complexity of their lives and giving them a chance to speak, and also feeling like the media that they consume actually reflects them and reflects, their heritage and their experiences.
Yeah, and I think it probably goes even further than that often the media's directly harming people in communities, which is another reason why we need to kind of take these approaches. Annie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I come from a similar perspective, but as you all know, who decides what is newsworthy and how you tell that story comes from a very particular perspective. And in newspapers or newsrooms, that is a white, cis, straight male still, older also. And that impacts what you read, what you see, and that can be harmful. And I think we're all just trying to find new ways to push back against that as best we can.
Yeah, thank you. So Rachel, Annie and Xing have all led projects which aim to address some of those structural problems in the industry through new ways of storytelling. And just so you're all not working in the dark here, I thought it'd be useful for them to briefly talk through some of the things they've worked on. And I think it's right to call this experimentation, I hope, because this is R&D, right, in a way. So we're trying something new, seeing if it can make a difference, seeing if it works, frankly, and then analysing how it worked, what worked, and whether we can fold that into then subsequent projects. So Annie, at the New Humanitarian, you led on a project called WhatsApp Lebanon. Could you talk us through that a little bit? And we've got some little videos so you can see sort of how that works. So yeah, go for it.
Oh, I can see it here. Okay, good. So WhatsApp Lebanon, meaning WhatsApp, what you use on your phones, is a bilingual, so Arabic and English interactive timeline that shows Lebanon's economic collapse through the WhatsApp messages and voice notes of 5 people who lived through it, Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, and Ethiopian. It was published 2 years after the August 2020 explosion that hit Beirut's port, which I'm sure you all heard of, but by that point, Lebanon was already deep into an economic crisis that has thrown the vast majority of the country into poverty. This collapse began at a time when, in late 2019, of mass protests, which was actually felt like a really optimistic time for a lot of people, so I think the fall was even harder. So as you scroll or click through the timeline, as you can see on the screen, you see what we might call headline moments, like the explosion, when there was fighting in the street. That's the explosion right there. But you can also see how hyperinflation, which is a term that honestly I think doesn't really mean that much unless you're living through it, impacts every single part of your life of the 7 million people who live in Lebanon, specifically those of the 5 contributors who shared their phone screens with us, Afaf, Basil, Rosa, Mohammed, and Roger. They're talking with their friends and families, not just on the days that make the news, about things like how to get to work when there's roadblocks. Here you see what it's like when you're trying to work and there's no electricity, where to get petrol. They're talking about COVID, things that the news doesn't really see. Also, one thing that really struck me was the messages of friends and family looking for baby formula and medicine that's not on the shelves. So you get to see moments of joy and jokes. I really got to know every contributor's sense of humor, everything. And I think that's the objective of this project, really, to show through the voices of the people who are living through it, how all-encompassing a crisis like Lebanon's and many of the situations that the New Humanitarian covers truly is.
Yeah, and I think you can already see what a different way of telling stories that is in a kind of non-newsy way, and we'll get into that kind of as we go along. And Xing, you worked on the Unfiltered History Tour at Vice. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction to that?
Yeah, sure. So the Unfiltered History is what I would describe as a guerrilla tour tour through the British Museum. You don't have to be in the museum when you take it, but it helps. There are two options. You can basically select two routes when you go to the unfilteredhistorytour.com. If you're in the museum, what you do is you'll be led on an interactive route through the different rooms, pinpointing certain artifacts. Then you scan it with your phone, and then you will put in headphones and listen to the voices of people from the original country of the artifact, explaining to you how this artifact was taken from their country, in some cases in very dubious circumstances, sometimes in outright illegal situations, and why the artifact should return back to its homeland. So in total, I think there are about 10 to 12 artifacts. There are some artifacts that are quite well known. So for instance, the Parthenon marbles are in there, but there are also some that are slightly less well known. So for instance, Hoa Hakanai, which is the Easter Island statue that's in the British Museum. Not a lot of people know that, for instance, it was ripped out of the ground by British sailors and presented to Queen Victoria. And basically, it's an audio tour through the world narrated by voices from the countries these artifacts are originally from.
Cool.
The idea is that you're unfiltering the British Museum's interpretation of the events that led to that artifact being there, and you're actually listening to the true stories of these artifacts as told in the voices of people from that country.
Right, we'll have a little bit of listen to that, if that's okay.
The British Museum is a public institution dedicated to human history, art and culture. Come discover over 80,000 works from around the world, here in London. You are now viewing the Guigal Shield. Captain James Cook was a British event.
We're now looking at the Guigal Shield, which was taken from my people.
Collections in the British museums are premised on a simple idea. I'm proud of what my grandfather stole from yours.
The Rosetta Stone was not the discovery neither of the French, neither of the British. It was already discovered and reused in Egypt multiple times.
For us, it's not just a well-carved rock, it is a living ancestor.
This very important statue is on display in a museum thousands of miles away.
Say the British Museum is the world's largest receiver of stolen goods. We're launching an interactive tour of some of its most contested artifacts.
We're now looking at the Guigal Shield.
The Rosetta Stone.
Hoa Hakananaya.
If they are saying that they are not going to return the objects that were looted from the kingdom, that means the children and the grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren of those that attacked my empire before are still very much in business of attacking the empire.
Museums around Europe are slowly realizing that exhibiting items taken by force hundreds of years ago from other countries is kind of gross. And it's about time. We can't change the past, but we can change how we engage with it in the present.
Lovely, thank you. We get a really good sense. Yeah, for sure, right?
It's a trailer. Yeah.
And like Baby Zing there as well. So Rachel, we'll talk about that in more detail as well, about how that's a kind of guerrilla operation as well, which is really interesting stuff in there. So Rachel, you're facilitating community-led investigations at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, where we used to work together, and you're also leading on a project called It's Criminal, which is a participatory theatre project looking at crime reporting. So do you want to kind of explain a little bit about that?
Sure thing. So I guess I'm kind of approaching most of this work through the lens of investigative journalism, which is a slightly strange field anyway, because it's one that people feel quite territorial over and, often think that there's only one model of doing it. So kind of across both pieces of work, we're trying to challenge that. The community-led investigations pilot is very much looking at how you can do investigations from the grassroots up. So rather than the journalists coming up with an idea themselves in a slightly ivory tower way, through sources, contacts and so on. The idea is that you go out into communities, usually communities that are harmed or ignored by the media in some way. You work with them to surface stories, but as journalists, we kind of make sure that what we're finding are systemic patterns that we can kind of properly investigate, and we'll then investigate those with those communities. So we're running the pilot this year, and the first investigation is underway, and the first investigation is looking at heat inequality. So we wanted to look at kind of making people more aware of climate change as an issue in the UK, which generally isn't a super hot country, looking at that locally, and looking at how heat waves and high levels of heat and heat stress particularly impact people with existing health vulnerabilities, and also people in poor housing. So we're working in 3 areas of England. We're working in Sheffield, Southwark in London, and Southampton, and we're working with communities in those areas. They will have specially designed heat monitors that we're producing in association with the University of Glasgow in their houses, and they'll record the heat in their household over the summer. And they will also be journaling across the course of the summer to say what they're experiencing during the course of the period. And we will then do a big piece of kind of multimedia storytelling work towards the end of the year, sharing the findings. So that's the first project as part of that pilot. The other project I'm working on at the moment is with the Ferret, and it's called It's Criminal. And so the kind of reason for starting this piece of work was there's quite a lot of evidence that traditional crime reporting can impact quite negatively on particular people, on particular neighbourhoods and particular communities. There's been some quite good work done in the States in this, but nothing's really been done in the UK. So we're working in Glasgow, and we're working with a group of about 12 people who either have experience of the criminal justice system or who come from communities that have been kind of associated with criminality in the news. And we're going to be exploring the issue together with various theatre practitioners and then putting on a live theatre show in June, hopefully, in Glasgow. So it's just kind of really looking in the area where journalism and theatre can potentially overlap and do something different.
Cool, thank you. And just to give you an example of that phenomenon Rachel describes, I was in a meeting with the editors of the two big newspapers in Wales where I live last week, and they were like talking about how their crime reporting is about shining a light on the criminal justice system. And I said, I'll just look at the first tweet from the Wales Online, and it's like, recognise these the 10 criminals banged up this month in Gwent. And it's like, guys, don't pretend what you're doing is actually shining a light on the criminal justice system. Do it, but don't pretend it's anything else. So I'm going to start pretty straightforwardly with the discussion by asking to what extent this work has to start by decolonising our newsrooms so that the appropriate time and resources are dedicated to this work. Because I sometimes think I always think we treat diversity and inclusion as if they're problems external to newsrooms, when the whole point is that they're internal. So Annie, you and I first met when I helped facilitate a process of decolonisation that you undertook at the New Humanitarian, and that was positive, but frankly it was also painful and difficult a lot of the time. How much do you think doing that work, I mean it's not perfect, how important do you think doing that work was as a necessary condition for doing something like WhatsApp Lebanon?
I think it was essential, and I should say it's an ongoing process, and it sort of always is, but changing staffing, changing, as I said earlier, what we think counts as news, changing the voices that we amplify. We talk a lot now internally about, as a Middle East editor, for example, let's say we have a story on drought in Iraq, which is a major issue, that, Iraqis in that story are not just victims. You can also go to the Iraqi professor of climate. You don't need to go to the think tank in the UK. And in the case of WhatsApp Lebanon, we had a project coordinator who was Lebanese and an art director and illustrator who was Lebanese. And without them, who have, two people who've lived through the crisis themselves, deciding being in positions of power, deciding how this project should go, having, important voices in what images should be used, how they should be used. I don't think it's really possible to do this work.
There's something important about that it came up in the work with the New Humanitarian, it comes up in other conversations I had, that people sometimes think, those people won't be good at being journalists, right? They're not going to be good enough. They're going to not meet our standards, whatever they are. And actually, what you get is a different kind of storytelling but not necessarily worse, arguably better, I guess.
Look, the project coordinator that I worked with had done one freelance piece. I had worked with her on one freelance piece, and I could immediately tell that she was amazing at, she had amazing emotional intelligence and totally got the point of this project. And we just need, that's honestly just frankly ridiculous.
Yeah. Emotional intelligence, highly underrated in journalism.
Indeed.
Xing, for your newsroom, how was that?
I mean, I think it's all just it's all just an ongoing process, isn't it? I mean, the way that this project came about is quite unusual in that we were actually approached by an Indian creative agency called Web Chutney, who had seen a short-form video series I made on YouTube called Empires of Dirt, which is about the British Empire. And they kind of approached us and said, oh, we really love the work that you're doing. Have you ever thought about partnering up with a creative agency to do something? And together we came up with the Unfiltered History Project. And, sometimes this happens, you'll get approached by a creative agency who usually want to use some part of their working hours to devote to a kind of social outreach project. A lot of the time, it's never really a good fit. But with Web Chutney, it was a really natural fit. We were interested in the same things. I'm also originally from Singapore, so I'm from Southeast Asia, so I really got on with the team. We came up with this idea of the British Museum kind of tour, because I think especially if you grow up from, outside of the UK, the British Museum is always held up as this tourist attraction, this, arbiter of global knowledge, and that's very much the way it likes to portray itself. But over the last few decades, there's been increasingly urgent calls for it to start repatriating some of its artifacts. And the idea is that we would kind of allow people to take the tour and make up their own minds by exposing them to voices that they wouldn't ordinarily hear in the British Museum. And I think the reason why it kind of worked so well and we got away with it, so to speak, at Vice was because people for a while were like, oh yeah, the side project that you're working on. Eventually it became one of the most successful kind of special projects that it's ever done. It went to Cannes Lions and won a lot of awards. But I think almost by flying under the radar slightly and kind of keeping it to the side and not almost shouting about it very much, we managed to get a lot of work done on it. And, we were investing a lot of our own time and resources into it and working with new teams that we'd never met before. And that was really rewarding, because I don't think that this would have worked if it was a British creative agency, because they always would have been said, well, maybe we should do something else. Maybe the British Museum isn't what we should be directing our attention to. And I think it really helped the fact that, we shared a similar background, and the Indian creative agency was so dedicated to it. So a lot of the technology that we use is their technology, so they devoted teams to it. We developed the editorial voice and the editorial strategy and direction, but we would never have been able to build that kind of tech team in Vice itself. It was very much something that we could have only done with each other.
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of this work is about getting away with it. But I think it's that starting point as well as working with different people entirely is a really great starting point. Now, Rachel, you and I worked at the Bureau and worked on some work on decolonizing journalism about 3 years ago when it was cool. And so I would think with the Bureau, I can say this because I no longer work there, that actually this is not a kind of graph that goes like this, right? It's a graph that goes up and down like this, and you have to hang in there. So what's your reflection on that, putting you in an incredibly difficult position?
Awkward. No, I think it's a real... it's a chicken and egg question, what do you start with? Because you're not going to be able to start with a fully decolonised newsroom. You're going to have lots of small battles and discussions, and it's about culture change, and that takes time. And then sometimes it's also about proof of concept, that if you don't do practical work that illustrates how doing things differently can be really good and popular and change things, if you don't do that work, then, you're not going to persuade people. I think it's important to reflect on the background that, funding is difficult in journalism at the moment. Media outlets are often nervous about taking risks. There's quite a lot of kind of aversion to the idea of failure, whereas I think because of the nature of a lot of this work and the fact that lots of it is quite experimental and there are things that can go wrong or it might even not work at all, there's a lot of fear around that. And there's also an inherent risk that if you do run a project and it fails, that people who prefer the status quo can then point at that project and say that's an example of why that new way of working doesn't work. So it's quite a tricky process. But I do think that, Doug mentioned the under the radar thing, and I think that's true quite often. You do have to develop something a little bit under the radar till you've kind of got it ready to go. But once you do that, it can really change people's minds. And people are often more open to this kind of work than they even think they are themselves. Sometimes it's about picking the right language and kind of understanding what people's values are in the newsroom.
I was going to pick up on that, actually, and in a way we can go back down the line on this, is that with your community-led investigations, for example, how are you bringing people with you in that process? Because part of the convincing is in the newsroom and then in the outside world. So what were your tactics for bringing people with you?
So there's a few things, I guess. One that I always think is important is framing and language. So use language that people understand and that resonates with them. So there's a reason this was called community-led investigations rather than calling it storytelling something,
My stuff.
Investigative journalists, know and respect the word investigation. So it was important to me that it was part of that same arena and culture. And, there will always be good and important investigative journalism that explodes corruption and villains and so on, and we're definitely not setting up to compete against that. It's just an alternative way of doing things that can also bring some really, really, really good stories to the table. The other tactic that I think is quite useful is working really cross newsroom. So, the Heat Inequality project that I mentioned, we're working across multiple teams in the bureau. So I'm on the bureau local team, which is the UK focused team. But one of my colleagues from the global health team is working on this with me. We're getting some kind of support, and we're working a bit with the environment team. We're also working with kind of audience and impact and production roles. And I think when you start working very cross-organisationally like that, you build a lot of allies and you build kind of advocates in different teams. And that really kind of helps with culture change.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be everyone. It can be critical mass sort of thing, can't it? I think you've already talked a bit about the kind of success of it and that helping drive future work, because I'm not saying this is advice or the Bureau, but quite often when you do this kind of work, some people in the organisation want you to fail, and then when it's successful, they want to take the credit. But with your work directly at Vice, how has that kind of success helped potentially make other work possible as well?
Yeah, I think going back to what you said about framing, it's all about framing. If I pitched something to my then manager and said, I'm working on an audio project to decolonize the British Museum, who would just have thrown it. Instead, the way that we pitched it to higher ups and also to our audience was, rather than, words like decolonize, which, they might not, have heard of, they might not understand, maybe they don't even agree with the idea of it, we instead pitched it as a kind of, the British Museum doesn't want you to know about this. Here's what you think. Here's what they think you want to know. But here's the truth, kind of thing. So it's much more about kind of emphasizing the guerrilla aspect of it, which then feeds into our heritage as a news organization and also appeals to a younger demographic who, increasingly want to draw the curtain back on institutions and, processes and want to see what the truth really is. So I think that idea of packaging really helps, and that's something I've really learned from this project going forward. It's not that the issue itself is, a dud in terms of whether or not people are interested in it. It's about how you approach it, and you need to be sometimes quite sly and clever. In your head, it's about decolonizing, an institution, but you might never say the word. And I don't actually think we said the word decolonize in the entire project once, even though, it's very obvious. I think once you look at it through that lens, it's really clear what it is. But we knew that kind of language might not land, especially with a younger audience who might not be familiar with academic terms like that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because sometimes people get fixated on the language, and that's not the thing, really. Annie, with yours, as we've seen, you've got a very different kind of storytelling, and both within and without of newsrooms, even in your audience, that's something quite new. So how did you see the response from audiences and within the newsrooms, and how did those things interact, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you can see, it was really an experiment, and it took 6 months, and there were, to be perfectly honest, a lot of times when I was like, this is a terrible idea, and it's going to fail, and, I think all of you can probably relate. There's a lot of pressure on, when you think you're doing either you think it's brilliant or, like, this is, you know, this is horrible. But if you have collaborators in the newsroom, collaborators, also my colleagues at the New Humanitarian and the illustrator and project coordinator who I mentioned, you know, that was very helpful along the way. And once it came out, the reaction was so amazing. I mean, to me, most importantly, from the contributors who, you know, whose WhatsApp messages were part of, or the most important part of the project, but also, you know, award nominations, people writing about it. And frankly, I think that did impact the way people inside our newsroom saw the project. You know, not everyone was in the newsroom was involved in the project because we have people, you know, working in different regions, different sorts of projects. And I think once people see that an experiment that can be difficult is also worth it and is really well received by the audience and by your colleagues, I'm hoping that, and I'm, you know, working on a, I wouldn't say similar, but a project about Yemen that is very much focused on stories told by Yemenis themselves. I'm hoping that it makes doing these sort of different projects a little bit easier.
Yeah. I'm going to assume we've got a bit more time because we started a bit late, so I'm going to come to questions in a little bit, but I want to fold a couple of questions together for you all. And there's two things really. For me, all of this work feels like it's not the journalist that's the important thing, or it's the journalist as facilitator rather than auteur in this, and how much of this work is actually about letting go of ego. And then sort of secondly, what it also feels really important is that there's got to be a lot of care in this, both for yourselves, because often you're doing this work as a kind of, as a vocation as much as, you know, a 9-to-5 job, so you put a lot of yourselves into it. But I suppose largely for the people you're working with, because journalism is still a pretty extractive kind of industry, and those are difficult things to manage. So Rachel, let's start with you as a community organiser as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the care one first, I think. I think it's a really, really difficult one, because I think that, so referring back to the first question, because you have to play so many roles when you're doing this kind of work, you have to be, yes, a facilitator, but you have to be a project manager, you have to almost, I don't know, you have to be looking at people's welfare all the time in quite nuanced ways. There are so many things you have to do that often it's very difficult to practice self-care, I think, in this area of work, because if you don't do everything that you need to do by a certain time, no one else will necessarily be able to kind of pick up all the moving pieces. So I think there are questions around how we do self-care in this field better. Some of it is having a support network of other people doing the same kind of work and at least being able to relate and talk about the issues. But I think probably what it needs is better resource within organisations, and that's the sea change that we need. If that's properly resourced, then there'll be more people in these projects, more kind of division of responsibility across the roles, and then kind of people doing projects like ours are really less likely to burn out. And I think, we have to absolutely prioritise care for participants and collaborators in these projects, but a lot of us end up putting that ahead of necessarily being able to look after ourselves. I think the ego thing that you kind of alluded to is also important. I don't think this work works if you're, you know, absolutely obsessed with kind of bylines and awards and so on. A lot of the work is going to be behind the scenes. Lots of people won't really kind of understand what you're doing. And my parents still like literally complain to me because when their friends ask what job I do, they don't know how to explain it. So I think just, you know, you have to be someone that's willing to kind of work behind the scenes a bit and get the joy and the reward from seeing the results and the impact, and that's the reward rather than the kind of the byline or the status.
I think that's something, when you talk about resource, it's almost time as much as money for everyone, because if people think this work happens quickly, then don't start, because it doesn't happen quickly. But actually your organisations probably want something quickly, and it's everyone understanding that this stuff takes time, right? Is that something you found?
Oh yeah, I mean, we pushed back the launch date for the Unfiltered History Tour so many times. And I think this is why also it was a good idea to kind of let it fly slightly below the radar of, you know, the weekly, monthly deadlines, because, you know, if anybody had seen how often we pushed it back because, the tech wasn't working, because the illustrations weren't right and had to go back to the second round of amends or third rounds, they would have been like, well, what's wrong with this project? And I think the thing is, with a story like that, going back to your first question, you just had to get out of the way of the voices of the people telling those stories, because even though some of them were relatively well established as repatriation activists in their own country, many of them had never been given a very large platform in the British press unless they literally turned up at the British Museum to advocate for the return of their country's artifact. And even then, a lot of the reporting around it, you can see it in the way the reporting was around Hoa Hakanai, which is the Easter Island statue. A delegation came from Easter Island to demand its return, and it was very much treated in the British press as ooh, look at these, people from abroad. They're dressed in costumes and they're asking us to return their stuff. What's that about? So they had never really been given a real substantive platform before, and it was very much for us as editors and the audio producer on it about getting out of the way so they could tell the story that they actually wanted to tell. And there was a lot of the time when we didn't know what they were going to tell us. And if you listen to the episode about Hoa Hakanai, which is my personal favorite, she ends it by singing, because the statue is considered a living ancestor, as in the soul of their ancestors contained within the statue. And by taking it away from its home, you're actually taking away a member of their family. And then she ends her episode by saying to listeners, if you see him, could you please play him this song? And she starts singing this song that's an ancient indigenous song from the region. And the first time that audio came into me for, edits, I cried, because it was so beyond what I could have wished for as an editor. I was not, that emotional impact, I think, just took me like a sledgehammer. And that's the kind of thing that I could not have, created if I'd scripted the audio, if I'd gone out and told people that there were certain beats I wanted them to hit. You just had to kind of sit with them and let them tell their own story.
Yeah, and that's the stuff you don't get on the little card next to it in the British Museum, right? That emotional sledgehammer, and it's getting out of the way, as you say. Annie, is getting out of the way what you're trying to do with here as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just moved and I was going through a stack of notebooks that I can't seem to throw away. Maybe some of you relate to that problem. And I had found a quote I had written down from, I'm going to read it, from Van Newkirk II. He was senior editor at The Atlantic. He did this amazing podcast called Floodlines about Hurricane Katrina, and he has, I think, a new one out, so check it out. But anyway, he said that storytelling has a savior complex. I think he meant journalism, and I think I haven't really been able to stop thinking about that. And I think, during COVID, as a journalist who came up in a sort of traditional way, I wasn't able to get on the ground, and we didn't want to send people right away for a variety of reasons. And I think it just made me realize how true that is and how important it is to step back and listen more. In the case, I think journalists, whether we realize it or not, we really drive the answers that people give to us based on the stories that we assign, based on the questions we ask. And in this case, these messages, these conversations had already happened. So I couldn't change them. I could have, but that would be extremely unethical. I did not. So I think stepping back is really in many types of journalism, not even in necessarily these big immersive projects, maybe the most important thing a journalist can do. I mean, it let us in on these honestly intimate moments that a journalist is never going to see. You're not going to be there in the middle of the night when someone's trying to figure out their presentation the next day and the electricity's going out. Or when you're at the bank and they won't give you your money and you're crying and you're texting your husband. I think listening and stepping back and giving other people a voice. They already have a voice. Yeah. Giving their voice a platform is the most important thing I can do at this point.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and look at that, the hands go up. I'm going to, in keeping, if you're a white man, you may not get chosen. I hope you'll understand. So yeah, go for it.
Thank you. Thanks for this fantastic conversation we're having today. My name is Lebo Khang from South Africa, based in Berlin. I'm a journalist and researcher. The first question I have is, how journalists navigate, a pushback against unconventional ways of writing? And are there newsrooms that are ready for this kind of writing? Because I'm asking because I've actually written a story just around our COVID in Soweto, where I come from in Johannesburg, where I've actually embedded myself in my grandmother's home, trying to make a point that the structure or the architecture of apartheid still perpetuates inequalities where people couldn't, do social distancing. And so I've really placed myself at that home and write that story. But of course I was conscious about doing it in a way that represents my community very well, with dignity. But that story landed in a platform that actually focuses on queer design issues and has been used a lot in design-related lectures, but not in a newsroom. And so, are the newsrooms really ready for such stories? Thank you.
Thank you. It sounds absolutely amazing, and I'll be searching out. B, I think, it's some of what we've been talking about. I wonder if one of you wants to pick up on that. Anyone want to pick up on that? Are newsrooms ready? Annie, go for it. You had your finger close to the button, so.
First of all, I really want to read that story, so can you please send it to me? Second of all, I guess yes and no. It depends on the newsroom, it depends on the editor. A lot of it, I think, as you probably know, if you're a freelancer, it's luck of the draw. I'm so excited, and actually with the freelancers that I work with regularly, I think a lot of people have learned to pitch they've been trained to pitch in a style that they think that I expect to receive as an editor. So, this is the news hook, this is who I'm going to interview. And, yes, sometimes that is the story that I'm looking for. But I've actually been, the freelancers that I know and that I've been working with for a long time, I'm always saying, what's your personal story? What is the story that you would write if you didn't think that if you weren't worried about whether it was going to get commissioned or not? So I think there are newsrooms that are ready, but probably on the whole.
Yeah. So perhaps that's about newsrooms being much more open, but transparently open about their pitching guidance being really open to different forms of storytelling, right? And modelling that, the ones that are really good at that. Thank you. Any other questions? I'm going to go to the lady at the end there. I'm going to be strict. I don't care.
Hi, I'm Juliet. I work mainly with NGO in the humanitarian sector and migration. I work in content development and writing. Annie, you might know that in this field we often don't really have the time. And you all presented really beautiful formats. But I was wondering if you have ideas for quicker format or which require less resources and time.
So, quicker formats. I think
Vice is good at that.
Sorry, yeah.
I mean, we've invested quite a lot in trying to figure out quick, short-form video formats, especially for TikTok. And I think what we try and do more of now is, we think of stories as like templates. So, for instance, we know that there's a strand of journalism we do that's like long-read journalism. So it's about thinking of a format and a template that we can just build ourselves from the ground up as almost like, WordPress, for instance, that everyone can kind of suggest ideas and features for, and then we can just build that and we can use that format repeatedly over and over again for different forms of stories. So rather than, which, the Unfiltered History Project is, which is like a one-off, like thinking more strategically about, okay, we're going to pour our resources into creating a certain kind of way we can deliver content. Like, what is the most kind of biggest bucket, I guess, of formats that we can create, that we can use repeatedly over and over again, trusting that the data and the information and the journalism that will populate that will be different enough so that people will feel as if every single time they're receiving a kind of premium experience.
Thank you. So I'm going to give one more question and we'll come back for kind of very quick kind of headlines. Does anyone else have a question?
Am I allowed, or should I give it to someone else first?
No. I'm going to, because actually, and I'm not going to be straight, you can have. Go for it.
Thank you.
It's a principle.
I was struck by the number of times I heard the word failure in all of your speeches today. And coming from a more scientific background rather than a journalistic background, how could we, as newsrooms, as an industry, redefine failure to be more honest and more applicable and more teachable in this process, which you all admit is very experimental?
It's a really good point. I think it's a perfect one to ask Rachel, because Rachel and I have been through this together.
And I suppose the fact that being able to do projects like this is quite rare, and they're quite few and far between, makes it harder to build up a bank of kind of evidence and learnings in a kind of scientific way. I guess what we try and do is kind of, although we're experimenting, create kind of prototypes and see what works and what doesn't. And then when we go on to do further innovation, make sure that we build off that kind of knowledge base. And I don't know if failure is even the right word, because it has such negative connotations. Maybe we just need to move on and call it something else. Because, you know, ultimately, if you're learning from something and you're making progress, then is that a failure or not? But,
I mean, I wish newsroom managers would be on board with that. So I'm very quickly, thank you all for that. I'm going to very quickly, kind of one line. What's the thing you've learnt, or what's the thing you wish you knew before you started this work? So I'll start with Annie.
Very quickly, when I came up with this idea, I thought that I would sort of put a call out on Twitter for people's WhatsApp messages, and that would be the project. And I learned, a lot of people were excited about it, but I learned pretty quickly, with the help of Zainab, who I've mentioned several times because she's wonderful, that it's very traumatic and can be triggering for people, even if they wanted to contribute, to go through several years of messages of, you know, maybe the hardest part of your life. And so we decided to pivot to work with 5 contributors who really wanted to tell their stories, and that we could work with really closely to make them comfortable with the process. So I think, you know, while there were multiple times that it seemed like there were mistakes and obstacles and pivots, I think, you know, in the end that actually turns out often to be a good thing. And it made the project the success, not failure, that I think it is.
I think flexibility and being open to doing things differently is really important, for sure. Thing.
Yeah, it relates to failure, basically. So one of the most amazing pieces of kind of advice I got from someone during the process of this project was, you know, every time you think of the word failure, just replace it with the word feedback mentally in your head, because essentially it is a form of feedback, really. Like when something doesn't work, when something didn't work, which it often did, especially on the kind of like tech and audio side, like it never meant the project was a failure. It just meant that it was a form of feedback. And I think in journalism, there's sometimes a very do or die mentality where, you know, either it works or it doesn't. Whereas in tech, actually, it's about iterating and, you know, prototypes, and you're constantly testing things, and things will go wrong, but that's good because you want to fix the bugs. So I think that was a really valuable lesson during the process of making it.
Yeah, and it also reminds me, funders, you can fund the process rather than the output, because the process is a really important part of this. Rachel?
It's a tough choice, but I think probably the most important thing for me is just learning to look at the entire piece in a holistic way. So looking at the journalists and collaborators on your team and the people that you're working with in communities as whole people dealing with complex things at home often. In terms of working with the public, journalism's obviously had a long history of using people as case studies, of having a story and then going out to find the person that's the perfect like jigsaw shape to fit into your story, and they only exist for a moment in terms of that one experience. So I think working with people in a way that you learn from their whole kind of being an experience rather than just one-off incidents. And I think it's also how we look at systems. So, you know, if you're looking at a particular issue, like an environmental issue or a health issue or whatever, seeing the context within which that sits, you know, potentially doing mapping, kind of power mapping, and doing real kind of detailed analysis to work out the context that the issue that you're exploring is sitting in. So I guess just that kind of word, holistic.
Yeah.
Maybe not holistic medicine, but
yeah, and that system stuff is so important, putting this stuff in the sense of systems. So I think the conclusion is this is incredibly hard, incredibly painful, incredibly wearing, but it's bloody worth it. So go ahead and do it. We hope we'll come back and hear about all your experiments next year. Thank you to Rachel, Annie, and Zing, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.